I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week we are going to be looking at the film Vengeance is Mine from the director Shōhei Imamura, talk a little bit about the Japanese New Wave, why I think Imamura is the Japanese David Fincher, and why I think Vengeance is Mine is a classic prototypical true crime story told expertly by a master filmmaker. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is take a look at a different Asian movie by a different Asian director to try to help us understand the wide world of Asian cinema and get a better understanding that when it comes to Asian cinema, there's more than Kurosawa or more than Bong Joon-ho or more than Hayao Miyazaki, that there's a 100-year career of great East Asian cinema to really appreciate and love and explore, and that's what I want to do with this series. We've been covering a lot of different decades, a lot of different filmmakers from a lot of different countries, varying genres, and I try to pick a different director and one of their movies that I really like because it's a way for you to explore a little bit more about other directors, to learn about other directors. Because I think for a lot of us, we know the hits, and we learn about maybe Kurosawa in, say, a film school, or Miyazaki because he just won that Oscar. But there's so much more to it, and oftentimes these videos are meant to be kind of good starting place parts for the directors as well. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the many choices, so just look at this series as an opportunity to go, hey, I want to check out maybe that director, maybe I've heard of that movie, this is maybe a good one to start with. And I think Vengeance is Mine is a good but still interesting starting point. Actually, if you were to start with any Imamura movie, you may start with something like Pigs and Battleships, but we can discuss that a little bit later. How I essentially have been breaking up these videos are the first part talking about why I want to discuss this filmmaker, why I want to cover them, talk about some of their other movies, what makes them interesting, kind of what makes them great. And then the second half, the discussion of the film in particular, so we can discuss a little bit more about the themes that the filmmaker is interested in or what makes them unique, and then apply that directly to a film, in this case the 1979 film Vengeance is Mine. But jumping now into the discussion of the filmmaker, the reason why I choose the filmmakers for this show, first of all, do I like their movies? And that was definitely the case here with Imamura. I've seen quite a number of his movies and liked a lot of them. He's one of my favorite Asian directors, so it was a treat to go back and even explore some of his films that I hadn't seen. But the second reason why I wanted to cover Imamura is to talk about the Japanese New Wave, because we've talked about the kind of traditional establishment, the beginning filmmakers of Ozu and Mizoguchi and Kurosawa that were making movies in the 40s and 50s and really helped define Japanese cinema in particular on the international stage. But Imamura, I think, was really directly correlated to the Japanese New Wave, and you probably have heard of other kind of new waves like the French New Wave and directors like Francois Truffaut or Jean-Luc Godard. And, there's plenty of different kind of movements within film, whether it be the Australian New Wave or, in this case, the Japanese New Wave, or, other type of movements like Italian Neorealism or Dogma 95. All these kinds of movements or waves are, I think, a way to just help us categorize and understand the history of cinema, but in particular international cinema. I think for a lot of people, they're introduced to French movies in general by learning about the French New Wave, or in the same way people learn about Australian movies or Danish movies or what have you, are through these kinds of pyramids and viewpoints. And the Japanese New Wave, similar to the French New Wave, were a bunch of young filmmakers post-war, not going to war, and there were a lot of younger filmmakers trying to make movies about what it was like living during those times. Modern movies starring young people, looking at different themes that other filmmakers weren't. And in the case of the Japanese New Wave, you had those filmmakers like a Mizoguchi or Kurosawa, who we love. I've covered Mizoguchi on the channel before for this series, but when you look at the films of a Mizoguchi, let's say, during this time period, late 50s, early 60s, it was Princess Yang Kui-fei and period pieces, going back in the past. Same thing with Kurosawa. You look at his films made during this time, The Hidden Fortress period piece, Yojimbo, a great movie, but a period piece going back in time, not necessarily trying to reckon with the modern Japanese life. And it took a lot of these kind of younger filmmakers to do it, including Imamura. And Imamura got big international acclaim with Pigs and Battleships in 1961, and then continually put out great movie after great movie, The Insect Woman, Intentions of Murder, The Pornographers, before kind of in the 70s more so going towards documentary feature, before kind of coming back into his later period, also making interesting movies. But you can definitely see a shift in his filmography in terms of the way his viewpoint manifests itself on the actual themes of the stories he's telling. So I mentioned at the top of the video that he feels like a Japanese David Fincher, in that, similar to Fincher, they, I think, have a deep kind of nihilism on the world. There's a darkness, a sadisticness almost to the way they think about things and the types of films that they make movies about. You know, you look at Imamura, he's making movies about like the seedy underbelly of serial killers, of soldiers, of pornographers, and his viewpoint is that kind of intense, nihilistic, hopeless kind of a viewpoint. But in his earlier films, it was more so how society was failing the younger generation and placing some of those problems on this kind of social constructs of the way Japan was going. But then you see in his later films less a nihilism about society and more nihilism about the human soul. And we see a lot of these kind of later movies about just animalistic tendencies in terms of the kind of way our deep monkey brain type selfish impulses ultimately are our downfall, that we can't escape that kind of animalistic desire for sex or for greed or for selfishness, that it's kind of this dark soul within every human. And in the beginning of his career, kind of satirizing that throughout the kind of Japanese culture and the American influence on that. But then with his later movies like The Ballad of Narayama or Vengeance is Mine, or even I'd say The Black Eel or The Black Rain or The Eel, we really start to see more of that kind of really kind of dark, intense, but still kind of, I think, psychologically fascinating worldview. And it's also interesting, I wanted to cover Imamura as a filmmaker because so much of what we think of Japanese culture has to do with like respect and tradition and emotional reserve. But Imamura, the types of movies he's making are in direct opposition to that. They're young people, they're pornographers he's making movies about, or they're about drugs or murder or sex. It's very kind of more modern themes, and I think for a lot of people they don't necessarily think of that when they think of Japanese movies. So I thought, exploring the films of Imamura shows us a different side of what we think of Japanese culture, and I think maybe feels a little bit even more Western because of its correlations to something like the French New Wave. Still very exciting. So what makes him interesting as a filmmaker to me is that kind of psychological approach to his movies, where you can see these kind of thematic similarities throughout all of his movies. Yes, he's a technically skilled director. Yes, he's got a beautiful eye and great moving camera work and multiple kind of shots within a single take. And he's got a great eye, absolutely. But what I think is so fascinating is his kind of very primal, nihilistic approach on how kind of our internal impulses ultimately lead to our downfall. So a fascinating filmmaker. If you haven't seen any of his movies, just pick one. That's what I really think. You can start with Pigs and Battleships or Vengeance is Mine, or The Pornographers or anything really. I think if you start with any of them, you'll really be able to get an understanding quickly of kind of his worldview and what makes him kind of an interesting, I think, Japanese auteur. But now transitioning over into my thoughts on Vengeance is Mine to help us understand kind of those larger themes of Imamura's career, how that applies in this case to a singular movie. If you haven't seen the movie, let me know in the comments down below, and you can skip this part and check it out, or just hear some of my thoughts. It's going to be a spoiler-free conversation, as it is every single week, but we're still going to talk about some of the larger themes of the movie. But if you don't know that the movie is about a serial killer who has these kind of impulses to kill, and we don't know why, and we kind of just see him on the run from these murdering sprees as he kind of gets together with the wife of a brothel owner, and kind of their relationship as we kind of bounce back and forth between the present and the past as we're trying to psychologize this man and the reason for why he does these things. And it's a fascinating movie because it's a movie with a goal that will never be achieved. That is, this movie is set up to almost try and figure out and try to understand why this guy is the way that he is. Kind of told in a series of flashbacks, we see him get arrested really in the first scene and doesn't deny that he did all these murders, but it's kind of like a confessional type movie where we eventually learn the reasons or the stories for what he did. And I mentioned that it's a movie without a kind of defined goal, because it's a movie trying to psychologize the reason for this guy and the reason why he's doing these things. But the movie knows that we'll never find out. And it's fascinating to take a serial killer with no kind of sympathetic traits and make him the main character of your story. But Imamura does a fascinating thing in that he doesn't ever try to sympathize with him or try to understand him. He keeps us entertained by having the characters try to psychologize him, and as we get to learn more about his life and his relationship between his old wife and his father, and his new kind of girlfriend, and the way he kind of approaches life, we are still engaged because we, like the other regular people, are trying to figure out why this guy does these things to try to stop him from doing that. But Imamura knows that we'll never find out. So the way he shoots him is always at a distance. There's a lot of medium shots. There's a lot of shots where there are frames within frames. So we'll see an image, and he'll be placed in the middle of the frame, but then there'll be, say, doors that kind of cut off our access to him. So we're not kind of seeing a shot of him, camera right in front of the actor, looking directly at it, for example, or a traditional over the shoulder. It's always at a distance. It's always like we're peering through and looking through a fence window, a house window, through another room, indoors. Really interesting kind of approach, and what that does is make the movie feel very cold and make the main character feel very distant, because he is this kind of psychopath. So it's a fascinating psychological kind of experiment, because we're trying to figure out why this guy does things, because he's our main character. We have to try to follow him along, but we never get those answers. And Imamura, as a filmmaker, is constantly removing us from that main character, which makes the movie feel kind of cold and scary as a result of that. And the film has this kind of non-linear approach, because it's almost like a series of flashbacks of him retelling his different types of murders. We see him kind of in the present day, we see him many years ago, we see him when he was a kid, and it gives the movie this kind of non-linear sense where we don't know where it's going to go. We don't know how that one scene to the next will relate to the overall story. And that actually, I think, creates a sense of tension, because there's not a linear story, because you don't know where things are going to go and where things are going to end up. We don't know the relationship to this character when we meet a brand new character. So when we see him talking to an old man on a subway, we don't know if that's going to set up a new storyline or if he's going to be the next victim. And I think that creates an incredible amount of tension to the story, because we're always on edge of this guy, is he going to kill this guy, or are they going to have a couple more scenes and then he's going to kill him? Are we trying to figure out a reason why maybe something he says connects to something we saw in another kind of past memory, which is the reason why he killed him? Or is it just based on this kind of animalistic impulse? And then we also kind of explore the connection between murder and sex, and kind of the connection that the main character sees the two together. And I mentioned at the top why I think this is just a classic kind of serial killer type movie. It's because the reason why the true crime movies are so popular is because normal people don't totally understand that thinking. But yet we're fascinated by it. We're fascinated by this idea that someone would have this impulse to kill. And we try to go back to their childhood, their relationship with their father, or the women in their life, and try to figure out everything. But we don't get those answers. So because there's this kind of asking questions without an answer, we still seek that answer, even though we know that it is kind of a fruitless endeavor. And I think Imamura is fascinating in the psychology of our audience and our own desire, in a way, to learn more about that, about how the sins of other people can create a kind of monster like this, and how almost left unregulated or left uncared for, that someone can kind of morph into this type of monster. So Imamura is a fascinating filmmaker, beautiful kind of painterly shots in this, while also being kind of a super interesting psychological exercise. If you like these types of true crime movies, these movies about obsession, movies maybe with more unpredictable narratives that can create a very tense, thrilling experience, I recommend Vengeance Is Mine, because it is a totally different type of movie that we've covered so far on this channel, and another prime example that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Shōhei Imamura's filmography, or Vengeance is Mine, or even maybe some of his other more popular movies. Ballad of Narayama won the Palme d'Or, so maybe you've seen that. Or Pigs and Battleships is another popular one because it premiered it with Criterion alongside something like The Insect Woman, for example. But lots of great movies to talk about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.